Welcome back to J100. This is Lecture 8 on the press post World War II as well as the golden era of the Philippine press. Historically, on February 1945, in accordance with the Tidings-McDuffie Act, U.S. President Harry Truman issued the Proclamation 2695, which declared that by July 4, 1946, the country would be officially recognized as an independent nation. When the Philippines gained independence from the United States on July 4, 1946, Manuel Rojas was elected as the first president of the new republic. If you recall, Rojas was a general under the USAFE and fought alongside the Americans during the war. It also ushered in the golden era for the Philippine media, which we will put as the period from 1945 to just before martial law in 1972. The Philippines was dubbed, or the Philippine press was dubbed as the freest in Asia, and the press functioned as a real watchdog of the government. It was sensitive to national issues and critical of government mistakes and abuses. So, this, in a way, was an influence of the American press, which had taken the role or the adversarial approach as watchdogs of society. At the same time, there was an end to government censorship, or at least the formal censorship. Of course, the laws such as libel were still in place. And it also became the era of big business and media monopolies. Why? Because as we had gained freedom, we had also gained a free market. So, what was the Philippine press scenario at this time? So, as we said, the post-war era initiated the golden era of Philippine journalism or Philippine media in general, because even our cinema flourished at this time, radio and television began. So there's much to celebrate in terms of media. At the same time, we find that the many of the newspapers that existed during the war period had ceased to exist because the raison d'etre no longer existed. And of course, since they were sustained mainly through donations and personal initiatives, it could no longer be sustained under a free market system. So small, militant, dissenting newspapers also lost their market and ceased to exist or simply stopped printing. For example, Free Philippines, which was a paper initiated by the USAFE all over the country in various community papers, ceased to exist because they said, well, they had really intended to last only for as far as long as there was a war going on. Then, of course, you had smaller papers also in critical of the then Japanese government, who had also ceased to function, such as the Philippine Liberty News, owned by Manuel Manahan, Manila Post, and Manila Tribune, the Huangco paper, which dedicated itself to promoting Philippine American understanding. So media became a commercial enterprise. And what happened was that there was a marriage of convenience with large business enterprises and political groups, which unfortunately are still present today. So you had the taipans, or the rich, powerful political families, backing up your various media establishments. For example, you had the Manila Chronicle, which was owned and operated by the Lopezes, the Manila Bulletin, Manila Times, and Evening News, as reported by your classmates. At the same time, because as in a way as a result of the taste of freedom, perhaps responsibility was a little abused or forgotten, and so they also felt a need to have to put in place self-regulation. This was to address the abuses of media freedom. At the same time, to train journalists. Many of the journalists at that time did not even finish college, and were more idealists than real journalists. So, what what they needed to supplement the lack of academic education were training programs to make them better and more professional journalists. At the same time, you also found the resurgence of the broadcast media, and we will see the evolution from radio to television. The Republic Act 3846 and the Radio Act, which was passed in 1947, stipulated the need for a franchise and that stations changed their call letter from K to D so as not to be confused with the United States call letters. So today we have DZ for radio and television stations in Luzon, DY for the Visayan stations, and DX for those based in Mindanao. This is also in a way, the origin of the need to have broadcast media apply for franchise in Congress. And it's the basis of the ABS-CBN franchise renewal or non-renewal just recently. So, well, radio was primarily operated either by government or by big business. Government had one station, the DZFM, which was initiated by the U.S. Information Service right at towards the end of the war, and they had given the allocation of the frequency as well as the equipment to the new Philippine government. And then the of course the radio stations that had been co-opted by the Japanese government or closed down returned to their normal broadcasts, such as the DZRH, which reopened in 1946 back with the Elizalde family and the Roses family behind it. You also had the start of the Cebu Broadcast Company and their DYRC in 1947, and DZBC or the Bolinao Broadcasting Company. The first television was initiated in 1951 with a combination of two radio giants, the Alto Broadcasting System and the Chronicle Broadcasting Network. Now, it can be noted that the Alto Broadcasting System was the one that brought in television into the country, specifically by the brother of the incumbent president Elpidio Carino, because he could not physically campaign because he was a person with disability, and therefore his brother Antonio decided that to help his brother's campaign, he would bring in television so that the electorate can see or can see his brother give his message. So he had partnered with James Lindbergh, who had already been operating DZBC since 1946 under the Bolinao Electronics Company. Um, Later, they began a partnership which started the DZAQ TV, which was the first television station in the country. A few years later, in 1956, Eugenio Lopez Sr., who at the time owned the Manila Chronicle, established the CBN or the Chronicle Broadcasting Network, with his younger brother, who was the former Philippine Vice President Fernando Lopez. So you could see that our first two television stations were initiated by politicians and their political families. CBN was granted a franchise in June 1955 under Republic Act 1343 by then President Ramon Magsaysay. Later on, when Quirino, of course, lost the election, precisely to Ramon Magsaysay, the Quirino, the Quirinos also decided to sell their shares of the BEC to the Lopez family and thus formed the ABS-CBN. At the same time, as a rival, Bob Stewart, an American who had been operating a radio station under the Republic Broadcasting System, put up the DZBB TV Channel 7 in 1960. We know this today as GMA 7 Network. He was followed by other entrepreneurs, and in the course of the next 10 years, the country had some 18 privately owned channels throughout the country. Teodoro Locsin Sr., or Teddy Man, editor of the Philippine Free Press at the time, described the post war media as thus: never had the press been so free. Never had it wielded such power and influence. The government was but recently established and uncertain of its strength. It was extremely sensitive to public opinion, and the press took advantage of this healthy state, pouncing on the government's least mistakes and making national issues of them. The power of the press was utterly out of proportion to the circulations of the various papers. None could claim a sale of more than a few thousand copies. There was censorship by the US Army, but military censorship was soon erased and finally lifted, and then it was open season and good hunting for politicians. So, as we said earlier, self regulation had become a necessity. And so, at the time, in October 29, 1952, at the initiative of newspaperman Teodoro Doroy Valencia, who is best known for his column Over a Cup of Coffee, which was published in the Manila Bulletin, decided to organize his colleagues and put up the National Press Club to promote cooperation among journalists and uphold press freedom and the dignity of journalists. So they were given funds by the USAID and other donors, and they were able to put up this building, the National Press Club, which you will find in the Intramuros, Manila area, outside the walls. And the building still exists today, although it is really worse for wear and um, not updated in a way. But it's still an iconic building, which unfortunately has been co opted by the current administration. Also existing is the Philippine Press Institute, which was established in 1964 by the Asian Program Committee of the International Press Institute. So the idea here, as led by editors and publishers of the major Manila dailies, led by Chino Roses, who was at the time running the Manila Times, was to boost the journalistic force in the country and give them intensive training programs. As we said, many of the journalists at that time were not trained journalists, and there was a need to professionalize the institutions of media. So the idea of the PPI was to foster the development and improvement of journalism in the country. And PPI, which still exists, still gives very good trainings to journalists, especially the community journalists, on various topics. Usually also timely topics such as election reporting, health reporting, to supplement, even today, it's needed to supplement college education and training. And then, of course, um, journalism schools had started to sprout in the country. Um, at prior to prior to the post-war period, most of the universities simply had liberal arts. There was no such course or academic program that was purely journalism. So, as far as we know, it was PWU, the Philippine Women's University, that started the program in 1960, a journalism program per se. But it was the Lyceum of the Philippines that established a more formal journalism program on May 21, 1962. If you will recall also from the documentary, the Lyceum of the Philippines was began as a legacy project by former President Salvador um, Jose P. Laurel. Then, of course, the UP, the University of the Philippines, set up the Institute of Mass Communication in 1965. This was initiated by Professor Gloria Feliciano, who had come from the Development Communication Program of UPLB. And through her initiative, they set up the program in Diliman. And today, we know it as our home college, the College of Mass Communication. We were followed soon by the University of Santo Tomas, which put up a journalism program in 1971, um, and other colleges as well, like the Pamantasan ng Maynila, ng Lungsod ng Maynila, and the Colegio San Juan de Letran, who of course already had an arts and letters program, but later on also established a journalism program. So more and more, many colleges that have either arts and letters um, college or a mass communication college start to see the need for an actual and established program for journalism. And with that, we see the progress of both journalism education and the journalism industry until it was cut short or cut abruptly by martial law.